I'd like to thank tonight, I think they're joining us, Sophia and Peter Volandis, who are the supporters for this series. We are so grateful to have this support. And we'd also like to thank our series affiliates. So you can find the complete list of everyone who supported this in our program. And we're so grateful for these organizations which help us spread the word and let people know about all the important programs that we're doing in this series. So, as we all know, Amazon's announcement in November 2018 that it would build its HQ2 in Long Island City triggered an outpouring of public comment. Pundits, experts, and regular New Yorkers alike debated the meaning and the possible consequences of HQ2 on New York's employment and job base, as well as its housing, transportation, and infrastructural issues on both a local and citywide basis. By February, of course, Amazon had reneged on its plans and really raising important critical questions about what this could mean for the city's future relationship to big tech and big business. So to discuss these questions, we are thrilled tonight to be joined by the architect and professor Vishaan Chakrabarti, city planner and writer Alan Mallach, sociologist and urban theorist Dr. Saskia Sassen, who I believe it will be joining us, community leader and activist Maritza Silva-Farrell, and our moderator, New York Magazine's Justin Davidson. So now it's my great honor to introduce our distinguished moderator. Justin Davidson has been the classical music and architecture critic for New York Magazine since 2007. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his criticism in 2002 and an American Society of Newspaper Editors Criticism Award. He's contributed to The New Yorker, W, Travel and Leisure, the Los Angeles Times, Slate, and Salon. He's also appeared on WNYC and NPR. And he is the author of Magnetic City, a walking companion to New York, which is available in our gift shop. And I know sitting out by the cash register tonight. So Justin will welcome our panelist and launch the conversation. So please give me a hand in joining him, welcoming him.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the Museum of the City of New York for hosting one of several panels around the city that just happened to be happening. Another one tonight, another one next week, all around the same topic, but ours is by far the best. But it's clearly a hot topic. We had originally planned this to discuss what the city was going to be like now that Amazon was coming, and we quickly pivoted to what the city was going to be like now that Amazon is not coming. I am eager not to relitigate the whole Amazon events, and we are going to be talking about what lessons came out of that, what we can learn, and recognizing that with or without Amazon, and in fact Amazon is still in New York and will continue to grow, even if not by the same order of magnitude as had been planned, New York is a tech hub and is going to continue to grow as a tech hub. And so this is a moment of inflection for the city, and there's so many things that flow from that have to do with transportation and housing, which we're going to touch on, focus on this evening, but along with all of these other questions of urbanism and architecture and how the city is organized. Because every industry has its own impact, and these moments where industries that had been a smaller part of the city suddenly start to flourish in a big way. If you look at the history of the city, those are always key moments in the development of the city, whether it's the refining sugar or the garment industry or finance or fur trading. Those were not in chronological order. Each one of those things, when you look, has consequences that are surprising. But often profound. So it's great to be able to discuss this with a panel. There's so much intellectual ferment around this topic happening on this stage. I'm going to start with Maritza Silva-Farrell is the executive director at Align, the Alliance for Greater New York, and one of the people who is really, down in the trenches in the fight over Amazon. We are hoping that Saskia Sassen, a sociologist from Columbia, will join us. I think she's having transit issues. Apparently, our subway in New York City is not perfect. Alan Mallach is the author of The Divided City, Poverty and Prosperity in Urban America. And that is a recent book. He takes a fairly long and broad view of American cities and how when some groups win and advance in cities, others don't, and the divides that those phenomena create, and how these things are not confined, certainly not to New York, but they also behave differently in cities that are doing well, cities that are losing population, and so on. And Vishaan Chakrabarti is an architect, has been a city planner, is a professor at Columbia, many other things, and has been involved in questions of of the development of the city, both at the macro and the micro level. And in particular, he is the planner, the master planner for Sunnyside Yard, which is, if you thought Hudson Yards was big, Sunnyside Yards is 7 times bigger. It extends from Long Island City all the way into Woodside. It's about 180 acres. And when you look at these big train yards and you stand there and you think, I wonder what they're going to do there, ask him. So, I wanted to start by asking Maritza. Your group was credited with having a significant role to play in beating back Amazon for a variety of reasons, and you were really successful at saying no to that particular company under those particular circumstances. So what I'd like to know is, what are the conditions where a tech company coming into the city in a big way, or tech growth, what is a scenario that you would embrace that would cause you to say, yes, this is a great thing for New York?
First, thanks so much for having me here. Good evening, everybody. That's a really great question, because I think that's the question that we all should be asking of not only the tech company, but also of developers and people who are building our city every single day. And the reality is that in order for a community to say yes, a community has to see that there is real investment and real commitment to ensure that people who live in those neighborhoods are going to be able to stay in places where they grew up, in places where they have their families. It is important for the tech industry to see that, we are not against Amazon just because Amazon is, is an easy target. We are against the model that we were against the model that Amazon actually is providing in terms of how the tech industry is growing. And the reality is that in order to say yes, we have to see that there is an analysis in terms of when Amazon prosper, and if they prosper, our communities need to prosper too. Our communities, meaning folks of color, particular low-income communities who have not been able to access to jobs, and by looking at what kind of workforce development will be provided, right? So we're talking about training, right? They talk about, we're gonna have these $50,000 jobs for people in Long Island City. None of that was actually clear in terms of how they're gonna be hiring in the community, how they're gonna be training in the community. And in order to say yes, you have to actually see all of those plans in place. And more importantly, a company that's trying to build and prosper needs to also think in relation to the impact that this will create. In Long Island City, the displacement of many folks who have had families for so many years was the biggest fear. Affordable housing already is a crisis in New York City, and in Long Island City was even bigger. At that moment, people were scared. We are going to be displaced. My family will have to find a place to live. So that's a problem. So the tech industry needs to think about like how they are actually engaging. And lastly, if you really want to come to a city, you want to think about, no extracting resources that we don't have. We were talking about trains earlier, right? Our trains need investment, right? Our state and our city needs to be investing public funds into our transit system, our schools, rather than giving capital funds to Amazon, giving tax incentives and tax abatements. So corporations and tech industry need to think about what it is the future that they want to see in a city that can embrace everybody and not necessarily coming in to a neighborhood to extract resources and just say, I want, and if you don't give me, I'm just going to leave, which is essentially what happened.
I have about 10 questions that just flowed out of what you just said, but I want to make sure that you in the audience also have a chance to ask them. What we've done is provided you with some cards, and rather than isolate your questions to a Q&A period at the end, if you have a question that occurs to you, write it down on the card. Some of the museum staff will come around and pick up the cards and hand them to me, and I'll fold it into the conversation. So feel free to ask questions and on the cards, and we'll collect them. So, Alan, you've looked at a lot of cities in detail and with a lot of data backing up your observations. I was struck in particular by one. You mentioned that in some cities, like in Baltimore, particularly for every person who lives in a gentrifying city, I think this data was from around 2014, for every person living in a gentrifying neighborhood, there are about 4 living in neighborhoods in decline. And one of the things that you outline in the book is this increasing divide between people who succeed in cities, neighborhoods that attract a lot of talent and people with educations, and that seems to come at the expense of some other people in the city. So I want to ask you, in response to what Maritza was talking about, the idea that a company or a big slice of an industry would come into your city and be confronted with a list of civic demands. We want you to make this a better place for everybody. How does that play out in other places? Is that a reasonable thing to ask in a capitalist society, that the company has a responsibility to improve the lives of the people who are already there?
Well, first I think it depends on, there are an awful lot of different kinds of capitalist society. And in fact, I was reading about how Pete Buttigieg, one of the many people wanting to become the next president, answered a question on television. He said, yes, America is a capitalist society, but there's no reason it can't be a democratic capitalist society, which is not really what we have. I mean, the strange thing is that probably 95 out of 100 cities in the United States are so desperate for jobs, economic growth, tax revenues, and so forth, that they do not make demands on corporations. And as a result, I think corporations assume that it's the norm to be wanted just for themselves and not for anything that they would necessarily contribute over and above. And in fact, we have an ethos that the role of corporations is to make money and generate jobs and tax revenues, and then it's the role of the public sector somehow to deal with whatever impacts that process has. I don't think that's a healthy situation, but I think that has come to be seen as the norm in this country. And I think New York may be in a position, by virtue of its incredible economic power, to be able to challenge that norm. But not very many places are.
Another thing that Maritza mentioned was displacement. Now, displacement is always framed as a kind of zero-sum game. If there are higher income people coming into a neighborhood, they're taking over land or existing real estate where people already live, and those people are being forced out. the issue of who gets to come into a city or a neighborhood or a region or a country is obviously very much on everybody's minds. It was really played a big role in the whole Amazon question. Vishaan, a couple of weeks ago when the president said that the country is full, you tweeted that there was kind of a paradox. I think you've revised it since, but you framed it very succinctly then, so I'm going to go back to your original formulation. Vishaan's tweet said, conservatives, the country is full. Progressives, the city is full. And that seemed to coincide with a New Yorker cover from a couple of weeks ago, which I think was a comment on congestion pricing, but also seemed to be about this question of, just whether the city is full. It shows the Manhattan side of the Brooklyn Bridge, and the roadway comes through the piers into Manhattan, but instead of feeding into Manhattan streets, the roadway just does a U-ey and goes back through the piers and back to Brooklyn, and there's a sign that says, keep moving, no vacancy. So, is the city full?
No. The city is not full. There's a statue in our harbor that talks about welcoming newcomers, and I'm terribly, terribly worried that the majority of New Yorkers have forgotten what that statue means. So here's the thing. I was a conditional supporter of the Amazon deal. I'm going to try to stick with your ethos of not relitigating. Maritza and I actually might look like we come from the opposite ends on this, but actually I agree with the vast majority of what she said in the front, which is there's no way they should have been allowed to come without supporting the infrastructure, the jobs, the local jobs, all the things that I think they were obliged to do in New York City. The problem was this: there was absolutely, there was so much heat and so little light. And what I was shocked to see was, and I do put this at the footstep of the president, because I think the president's driven everyone insane. I was shocked to see so many opponents, I'm not saying anyone on this stage, but so many opponents use the president's fact-free tactics. So for example, the $3 billion. So for all of the opponents who thought that Amazon was getting $3 billion that should otherwise go to subways and schools, where's the $3 billion for the subways and the schools? That money should be just sitting in a lockbox somewhere. You know what? It doesn't exist. It was but for money, which means that Amazon, over the course of many decades, was going to pay about $30 billion in taxes. We were giving them a $3 billion discount against that. So we were gaining 27. So what we just lost is $27 billion, right, to fix our subways, to fix our schools. Number one. And there were some people who didn't understand that. There are other people who were intentionally misrepresenting that fact. Number one. The second thing I would just say, and this goes to Alan's point, and this is, I think, the much deeper issue now that we are past the sort of Amazon debacle. Let's say the majority of people in this room, let's stipulate for a second, had a lot of legitimate questions about a company like Amazon. Monopolistic practices, union issues, supporting ICE. Then we find out they didn't pay any income taxes. So let's go through that whole list of issues, okay? And say, let's stipulate we're all concerned about that. What has, and you can say that they either turned tail or we ran them out of town, depending on your perspective. It sort of doesn't matter. What has pushing them to a sprawling campus in North Virginia done on any of those issues? Is Amazon going to change any of those issues because we've pushed them into some sprawl? Or is this just sort of out of sight, out of mind environmental and social justice policy, meaning if it doesn't happen in our location, then it's okay, it happens in a red state somewhere? Because nothing about that company is going to change. So what this seems to me is a symbolic victory. For those people who feel this is a victory, I think it is a symbolic victory, just like Donald Trump's wall. It is a symbol that we are somehow virtuous by not letting this happen. But back to your point, New York is one of the few cities that if we had let them in and had they started making financial commitments, I think we could have, once they had committed real dollars, turned the screws and started forcing some real change in some of their practices in a way that you're not going to see in Northern Virginia, precisely because of the issue that Alan mentioned, because most municipalities are not going to turn the screws on their companies. And then the last thing I'll just say is, as we talk about the future, how do we hold these issues in some consistent way? Shockingly, I've heard that New York City is about commerce. And there are big companies here like Goldman Sachs that I think someone quoted once as being a squid on the face of humanity. As people are saying, will Amazon unionize our workers? I didn't hear anyone say, well, is Bed Bath & Beyond doing that? Is Home Depot doing that? All these companies are already here. And if we're going to hold all those companies to that standard, how many jobs are going to be left in New York City? Right? So as we now talk about the future, I'm not saying each and every one of these issues is important. But whether we talk about them factually and consistently, I think, is also important.
I think a point you're making, I think, is really important, and I take it a step further, that ultimately it was about symbolism. Now, I was looking at some numbers. I like numbers. New York City is growing jobs at a rate of roughly 100,000 a year. Now, Amazon was going to add, since the ultimate goal was going to be very gradual, they were going to add about 1% to that total. Now, clearly, the difference of 1% in job growth is not going to have a significant impact on housing costs generally. Now, having a major facility go into a particular neighborhood can have an impact on its immediate neighborhood. But looked at writ large, the battle was largely a symbolic battle. And I think in terms of the impact, if one wanted to analyze exactly what the impact of Amazon would have been on housing costs and housing availability in Long Island City, I suspect that that issue could have been mitigated at a cost that would have been extremely manageable in terms of the overall financial impact of Amazon in terms of the city's revenues. So I think ultimately it was about symbolism, and it was about taking a stand. And as I said, perhaps New York is in a position where it can do that and still thrive, as long as Vishaan points out, it doesn't inquire too deeply into the behavior of the companies that are here already. But I think putting it in perspective, Amazon would not have so fundamentally changed anything about New York City compared to how it was perceived or treated in the media.
So Amazon was seen as kind of the tip of the spear of the tech industry, as a whole, which some people look at Long Island City and say, well, that's going to grow there anyway.
It is already.
And it's already growing. It's not just in Long Island City, but that is a natural place for it to go, particularly after the creation of the Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island, which is right nearby. So, Maritza, I was wondering if we take for granted that tech is growing and will continue to grow in many different forms, and we recognize that new industries, especially quickly growing ones, each one has kind of been associated at different times in the city's history with particular kinds of housing, right? So when we had sweatshops, we had tenements, and the combination of these work-live places, that created incredible density in a small part of the city. If you jump ahead to Wall Street, the connection between Wall Street and the creation of Battery Park City, for instance, So these industries have a profound effect on how we live and where housing occurs. Again, to try to make it positive and sort of look into the future, what would you like to see happen in terms of housing, not just locally, but across the city, as a result of a growing tech industry?
Yeah, thanks. So I want to actually answer a little bit of what it was mentioned earlier. I think the question here is, what kind of economy do we want for our city, for our state, and for our country? Do we want an economy that is driven by Amazon, $1 trillion corporation that can decide for the future of us? A company or a corporation, rather, that actually mines in our data, because that's how they make tons of money, by mining all into our data with their web services? Do we want a corporation like that to really manage our day-to-day, right? Which is kind of happening already. If you have Alexa, if you go to Whole Foods, you can experience some of this, right? I recently went to Seattle, and I actually got to see the situation in Seattle in terms of affordable housing, in terms of how much displacement and homelessness is the city facing today, right? So I saw some of those things and the implications of these kind of corporations growing in cities like ours. Moving forward, I think the question for all of us is just what it is that we want for our future, what it is that we want for our kids, right? The tech industry is growing, and the tech industry is the future. So we have an opportunity today, and we have an opportunity to decide how the tech industry can be on our side, on the side of the people, not on the side of corporations that have made millions and trillions of dollars out of our people, right? Or the backs of workers that right here in New York City, in warehouses, are being exploited as we speak, right? So we have to think, as somebody mentioned earlier, all of these issues in the context of big systems. So it's not so much of a symbolism, it's just much more about like what kind of corporation Amazon really is, and the kind of standards that they're moving for our city, for our country, and for the world. This is not a fight for New York City, it's a fight for the world, really. After the HQ2, I wanted to say debacle, the questions came from the press to us. What are you going to do? How are you going to, get these jobs? 25,000 jobs. Oh my goodness, we're going to lose all of these jobs. All of those were hypotheticals, and we continue to say that those were ideas. We understand, and we faced, and we have been facing the income inequality issues in our country for too long, where workers are not actually accessing to good jobs through the trickle-down economics model. Right? So what we can do today in terms of moving to the future is having all these community organizations, all these groups demanding and developing the kind of vision that they want for their neighborhoods, and developing the kind of economic development that it can actually work for them. So if there is $550 million going to be given to our corporation, let's just take those $550 million and give it to a community in a community development project with a nonprofit group who can build affordable housing in a vacant space, rather than giving the vacant space to a landlord or to our real estate, right? So there is ways in which we can actually think about developing our economy in a way that is fair, in a way that is equitable, in a way that actually works for everybody, because it's true. We live in a capitalist society, but we have to think about transforming the systems in which we live in that we already know having worked for all of us.
So I think this hits the central issue. And this is, because as a former city official, to me, this is the most fundamental challenge in our politics today. In the sense that there is huge dissatisfaction, especially among progressives in big blue cities, with the national economic system. Okay, fine. The problem is this. I find it extraordinarily challenging to try to solve national political and economic problems at the local level. We already, after 9/11, our city's budget was about $43 billion. The city budget that passed last year was about $82 billion. Nationally, we may be living in a supply-side economy. Locally, we live in a demand-side Keynesian economy. We spend an extraordinary amount of money on housing, on parks, on schools, on subways, most of which we don't get what we need from the federal government. So I would argue we already live in a demand-side economy at the city level. But the question is, where is that money coming from, right, that we're making all those investments in, right? We have to have the tax base to keep that going because we don't see any of that money from the federal side. So to me, the really difficult question that this raises, because I don't disagree, but the question is, what is a city official supposed to do, right? A city official...
This is your delinquent speaker.
Well, Saskia's in the house.
It's a great history.
Just finish your thought.
Well, to me this is, and I don't have an easy answer for this, but I just think that there's a fundamental paradox about the idea that we want a bunch of things changed at a national level. These, I'm sure Saskia at some point will talk about tech companies being excavation companies, which has already been raised. But how is a local government official supposed to deal with these issues? Right? Because a local government official, what they're trying to do is exactly what you say. They're all trying to generate enough tax revenue that we can house our people, build our parks, build our schools, and we can look at that and say it's not enough and keep hammering away at the idea that it's not enough, but that's what everyone's trying to do. I know the people who negotiated this stuff, both at City Hall and at the state. They're good, honest, hardworking people who were trying to deliver the right thing for the city of New York. And this is the fundamental challenge we face because you can't sit in City Hall or at 633 3rd Avenue where the governor's office is and change our national political and economic system. So what are they to do all day? And again, I don't have an answer to this, but I think it's a huge question mark in the times we live in.
Do you have an answer? This is Saskia Sassen. She's a sociologist from Columbia University, and she's been writing about global cities for a long time and has more insights and profound things to say about them than I could possibly summarize.
Well, first, my apologies, but I was caught up in I just flew in, but I was going to be on time, but I apologize because my driver was crazy, the police came, it was like a whole opera, and they wouldn't let me go.
This is a New York story.
I came from London, I landed on time at 12, so it's not like, the big systems work, the little systems falling apart. So here is my take about what's happening with cities. And a marking moment is the 1980s, when a new kind of economy begins to install itself in cities. And it's very much caught up with the digital, and it's very much caught up with internationalisms. When you read the literature of that time, they are always saying cities are no longer needed because you have the digital, etc., etc. And in fact, I was saying no, because these digital operations, no matter how much digital you have, you're going to need some material base, and we know for a fact that that is the case. But furthermore, insofar as this was a very networked economy, let's just focus on New York, but all the major cities went through this, as far as I'm aware of. And so what begins to happen is that as firms globalize, the big corporates need access to all kinds of forms of knowledge. They can no longer do it all in-house. And so what you have is a proliferation of highly specialized firms, each one of which can sell you 25 hours of Mongolian accounting, of Argentinian preferences for investment. They need each other. It's a highly networked sector. So when everybody was saying, we don't need cities, people are leaving the cities. Remember, cities were poor. Paris was poor, London was poor. We're talking the 1970s. New York was officially broke. They always do it properly, et cetera, et cetera. And so, but the work that I was doing told me, there's a whole new economy that is linked to the global. But if a firm wants to operate in 15 countries, they can no longer do all the work they need to do in-house. It just doesn't work that way. They need to subcontract, etc. What emerges out of that is this extraordinarily highly networked sector that you have to think of as this huge platform that sort of installs itself in all major cities, so that if the big corporates want 25 hours of this, 18 hours of that, etc., they can deliver. But this sector is very networked, very digitized, but they need each other. And so the question of the materiality of space is really present, you know, and I love that. I love that notion that this is very international, very digital, very high-end, enormous amount of wealth, but they need materiality. And look at the high financial sector. They also need only so much, but no matter how digitized, no matter how algorithmic mathematics is the dominant form, doesn't matter. They need terrain. And so the city, in my view, one of the negatives that we're experiencing in our big cities, and it's not just New York, is that this grabbing of land, if you want, to build up all these new enterprises, etc., has of course affected very negatively some of the more modest classes. And final point, can I just say one more thing?
Of course.
Yeah? Don't say of course, because
Well, you said did say final.
lecture mode. No, I won't. No, this is something that I'm doing my research on now that I wanted to also share. And that is the financializing of buildings. So that the most extreme case, just to sort of, give you an image, but it's the most extreme. It's happening only in a few places. An empty, luxury tower, whatever, for people or for firms, is not necessarily failing, because via algorithmic mathematics, and that's what is dominant now in the high financial circuit, nothing to do with microeconomics, nothing to do with that, because that building actually gets transformed into a field of materialities. The high investment sector is asking the financial system, you know what? I don't want derivatives. Derivatives, by the way, are for us. Derivatives are on the way down. Huh? So we are, for us, the commoners. In that high investment circuit, they don't want derivatives. They want asset-backed securities. Asset is the key word. And so what we see as a building, an empty building, the most extreme case, an empty building is actually a field of materialities that is delivering potentially more gains, because you don't have to deal with people, right? It's about assets. I don't know if I'm communicating. Is this a bit too weird? But even if you didn't understand it all, this is the most extreme case. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And the final little thingy, I recommend a film called Push, like Push, which is the representative for the United Nations on housing. She's gone to many parts of the world, spent time, and the film is amazing. How, and they have tracked big financial firms, how they are buying up big housing complexes for poor people. Now, what they're doing with it are two things. One thing is they're upgrading, and so they become very much fancier buildings. And the other thing is that, again, it works as an asset-backed security. So this is like a monstrous development, shaped by brilliant minds. Algorithmic mathematics is mostly physicists in high finance now. And they are just doing their stuff. They're not the high-level financiers who then extract the goods. So that was my contribution.
So do you see, you've focused on finance since 1980. Do you see tech as represented by a company like Amazon or Google as an extension of the same thing, or is that a new chapter? With new
Ironically,
dynamics?
I would say, when you look at, what's the one that was going to leave but then decided to, which is the one that Amazon. Actually, Amazon...
It's a little late to this conversation.
Amazon appears like a sweet little commoner, as the Brits might say, because they actually sell you stuff, and you find yourself saying, well, welcome, a bit of stuff that you and I can. But the problem is that it becomes this concentrated power vector that is destroying all kinds of little firms, But it is different from what I described. I would say Amazon is still in the last time I checked at least.
Amazon is, but we consider it as part of a sort of constellation of companies like Google that are really delivering intangible things across networks, but that result in very tangible, as you say, materiality, meaning buildings. Maybe Hudson Yards is the best, most visible example of some of this. But that is a little bit what we were dealing with Amazon and Long Island City, which is what was the city actually going to look like, feel like, how big are the buildings going to be, where are people who work there going to live, and how are they going to get there? All of these very nitty-gritty effects that flow out of some tech companies that do things that none of us, or some of us, really don't quite understand on a day-to-day basis. As an architect, do you have a sense of how the physical shape of the city changes in response to this industry?
It's this. Well, first of all, I think we use the word tech company in way too well, actually, no, I was going to say specific a way, in the sense that we think about, Google or Facebook or whatever. Every bank considers itself a technology company at this point. The three major car companies consider themselves technology companies at this point. So that whole definition, I think, is really changing and broadening. But to me, the territory of the city, which I think is sort of the question, most major cities had a form that was a hub and spoke form after World War II, with this idea that it had one or two downtowns. If you look at our subway map, right? So you have this convergence of these subway lines on Midtown and Lower Manhattan. What we've seen is that as the digital world has changed, there's a rejection of those central business districts. So I actually thought of all of the searing critiques of Hudson Yards, the sharpest blade was when Michael wrote that none of the new companies are actually showing up at Hudson Yards. Why? Well, where are the new companies? I mean, Google's in 111 8th Avenue. They spent $1.8 billion on this horizontal brick building that the Port Authority built in the 1920s in Chelsea.
Into Pier 57.
Right, and expanding into Pier 57. Now, that's partly because it's on the it's on the broadband superhighway for the Northeast Corridor, but it's also because their employees wanted to be in Chelsea. They didn't want to be downtown, and they didn't want to be in Midtown. And so we're seeing, whether it's Domino or Dumbo or Long Island City, that there's a kind of flattening that's happening in the city in terms of where jobs are going. I would argue that given a failing subway system, that this is actually a very good thing. When I was Manhattan director, the boroughs would all complain, how come all the jobs are concentrated in Manhattan? Now that people are talking about jobs in boroughs outside of Manhattan, people are worried about all the things that we have in Manhattan, congestion and all of the other things that come with that. But I still think fundamentally we want a flatter geography in our city for where jobs are. I don't think we want them all concentrated in Don Draper land. And so this is already happening, and I would argue it's actually quite a healthy thing, right? The issue is that accelerating either gentrification or displacement? And I think that there are different ways to think about that, because commuting we have this big affordable housing project in East New York, commuting into Midtown Manhattan from East New York for an hour and a half on the subway is a brutal affair. And so the idea that we flatten our jobs picture, I think, could be a very positive thing for communities if it's done the right way.
Even though we don't have the subway system that is aligned that way.
But we don't need the subway system anymore. We have City Bike, we have scooters, this idea that we're gonna get around the city on these multi-billion-dollar holes in the ground.
BQX.
That may become a very serious thing. 30% of the city's
hasn't
road.
so far.
Right. So.
But what's interesting, it's a different kind of flattening. I think to me, one of the most fascinating things I've seen, and this is taking place in dozens of cities, not just New York or San Francisco, is that the historic central business districts are becoming essentially residential neighborhoods. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the physical form of these districts, at least that part of the pre-World War II physical form that survived urban renewal, is not especially desired by companies today, but it works beautifully to be converted into high-density multifamily housing.
Like in the financial district.
And so the financial district actually, that transformation actually lagged similar transformations that were starting years before in other cities. But the other thing is that the profile is, it's not really flattening, because what's interesting about Dumbo and Long Island City and Chelsea and all these, this is the immediate periphery of the classic CBD. It's not Jamaica, and it's certainly not Van Cortlandt Park. It's a relative flattening, but it's, in some respects, it's just an expansion of the perimeter of what might be called sort of the central core, which is becoming much more varied with the residential downtowns and so forth, while you still have a very large periphery that is not benefiting that much from this, but actually one of the problems is that in places like New York, even though places like East New York, the Central Bronx, other places, they're not getting necessarily any benefits from all of the development that's happening. But because of the extraordinary price pressures in the core, that's pulling the prices up so that they have become, New York's low-income neighborhoods are vastly less affordable, not because of gentrification, but because of just the spillover effects of what's happening in the central core. If you go to almost any other city, except for like New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and one or two more, you'll find that the low-income neighborhoods are still very low-price neighborhoods, whether you're in Baltimore or Chicago or Cleveland or any of these places. But in New York or DC, you're getting that spillover, and that process, I think, is really affecting far more people than the immediate changes within the core, affecting them for the worse.
So I'm going to try to conflate a couple of questions I've had from the audience on the cards, which are about what we can do as citizens, as architects, scholars, thinkers, policymakers, to deal with some of these very large-scale systems and some of these very large-scale trends. Specifically, does the Amazon experience send a signal that we do or don't want to send to other companies, that they better toe the line, or that they need to operate here under certain conditions, that this is a not as friendly a business city as they might have thought? Is that a good thing, or is that to the extent that that signal was sent, is that a good thing? Does that show the power of the people, or does that say to people who would be paying towards that enormous city budget in taxes, sorry, we don't want your money?
Can I bring in a little transversal, it's like a little invading, a logic that invades what you're describing. And that is that I think the issue is that we have far too many of these enormous corporations, and we should enable at all levels of the city sort of local commerce. This is something that Europe has done better than we have. But this notion, we are giving the big corporates more and more of all the domains that produce what we need, on a daily basis. I'm not even talking fancy stuff. I think this is a real issue. And that means that the little money that is spent in a neighborhood, part of that, money disappears from the neighborhood. What you want it is to circulate. You know, I mean, it's a bit of a fantasy, but I think we need to get back to that kind of model. In other words, that you have a local economy which is going to be partial. The locals spend the money, the local bank can do a little bit better, the local shop can do a bit, so that we have a multiplier effect rather than an extractive logic that takes whatever the capacity for spending that a neighborhood has, just disappears from the neighborhood. You know, there is no circulation, if you want. I think this, for me, is one of the major issues that we confront.
Okay, but in Long Island City, I was looking at some data that a corporate real estate company produced that showed that when Amazon expressed an interest in Long Island City, the number of inquiries for office space from other much smaller companies jumped.
That's a good shadow effect.
Yeah. Right. So, but when the interesting thing is when they pulled out, no, the opposite happened. The demand soared.
Hey, well, that's great.
For 1 month, and then it dropped back. But it dropped back to where it was before they pulled out. And as far as I know, interest in Long Island City from other companies has really not diminished. The lesson appears to be that Amazon, even though they wound up not following through on their plans, showed the rest of the ecosystem, the business ecosystem, that this is a good place to do business. It was like sort of a declaration of faith. And so I'm wondering whether we're actually seeing a lot of the Amazon effect over maybe a slightly different timetable, even without Amazon. Any thoughts on that?
Can I
Maritza?
just I mean, I think I want to just share a little bit in terms of like who owns wealth, right? And here in New York City, the majority of wealth is owned by real estate, right? So I'm curious about that data that you're sharing. But the reality is that with Amazon, in terms of the model that we want to see for our city and for our country, has to be different. And it creates an opportunity for that circulation of wealth to happen in neighborhoods and in communities. So I will say, and I will argue, that the signal for Amazon or any kind of corporation is that times have changed. We here in New York City and in New York State have worked really hard to shift in terms of like who do we want to elect in government so that we actually have government representing us. And we cannot sell ourselves to whether it's Amazon or any big corporation just for them to decide again what our future can look like. Particularly when we're talking about people like Jeff Bezos, he is the most wealthy person in the world, right? So let's just think about that, right? So when we are here discussing how Amazon should or should not have come and what the effects or no effects of Amazon should be. Well, the real effect here is that people stood up, people spoke up, whether we're in favor or against, and we signal that corporations cannot demand from communities for their own benefit. And in the topic that you were just discussing, and I finished with this, in terms of like how corporations are used to actually doing that, like they are used to coming in, saying, I'm going to create these jobs, give me some subsidies, whatever that might look like, and we don't even have to pay taxes. In the meantime, the small bodega in the same neighborhood is paying high taxes, and the rents are going high, right? So we have to think about the model that we want to see in the city and in the country in a way that is more equitable as a whole, and now we have an opportunity to do it. So I think the effect in itself is that we have an opportunity to shift the model, and not only because we're in New York City, and I understand the point about local cities don't actually make big changes nationally, but we are in New York City, and we know that what happens in New York City really has a big effect across the country and the globe.
Well, I have to respond to that. I'm sorry. So hang on a second. So just like piece by piece. So what we did is we sent them to Northern Virginia. Right? Nothing. No, only half of them were going to go. So we sent them to Northern Virginia. Nothing about their policies or anything else is going to change.
And Nashville.
But what I don't agree with. First of all, they were going to pay taxes. I don't think you should say that. There's a public document. It's a public document, right?
They're well known to not pay taxes.
Pardon me?
Amazon actually is well known across the country that
No,
they
they're
actually
not paying
pay
federal
taxes.
taxes. They're going to pay local taxes. It's a public document, Maritza. Anyone can look it up. So, and this is what worries me. What worries me is that the signal we're sending isn't that we're closed for business or something, but that people will misrepresent the facts. And they will do it the way this White House does it, because that's the terms of engagement now, right? And that is extraordinarily worrisome to me, because someone has to stand up for facts and rationality. This is not just about ideology and symbolism. And we have a city to run, and the people who will get hurt the most are people who are low income, because, you know, we operate as if we've always been wealthy. And we simply, you know, we will have a significant downturn again, and rich people will be absolutely fine. What will happen is we'll have massive increases in crime, massive decreases in public schooling quality, massive problems with housing, all in our lowest income communities, because the city will be broke again. And, like, I don't understand why this is so difficult to understand, because we've got the history to prove it. And so I just think one has to separate these national issues if we want to change these things at the national level. Even the contest that Amazon ran is illegal in Europe. You can't do that. You can't have cities do this race to the bottom. Fine, let's change the national law. But don't for a second pretend that someone sitting down at City Hall can do that and not react or not respond in the context that we are in. That is unilateral disarmament, and it is very, very dangerous for a city like ours.
I'd like to just add one small point, and this is coming from the only person on this panel, I believe, who does not live and work in New York City. New York City and what people do in New York City are not as important to the rest of the country and the world as many New Yorkers think they are.
I'm not sure anybody in this room understood what you just said.
Yeah. So I think how people perceive what happened with Amazon in New York is, from the outside, does not represent a commitment to fundamental economic change. I think we need fundamental economic change. I don't think that's the issue. I don't think this is going to bring it one day closer.
Okay, I want to bring it back to the housing question, even if tangentially. We operate in a world, and maybe we can change it, but history suggests that, at least for the past few decades, we have not been successful in doing so, in which government, and by that I mean local government, because by and large the state and the federal government are not interested in housing, but specifically local government leverages its money through private investment in real estate and other companies. Now, there was an article a few weeks ago or a couple months ago, the headline of which was pointing out that Microsoft was investing $500 million in an affordable housing program, and the headline was, "Can Big Tech Solve the Housing Crisis?"
To which you tweeted no.
To which I tweeted no. Next question. However, but it did raise a question for me, which is, given the fact that that government simply does not build housing anymore.
It's illegal.
And so all housing depends on a combination of government money and private enterprise. So in that economy, Maritza, I wanted to ask you, how do you see that working if the signal we're sending to companies large and small is, if you want to be here, you got to sit down and we're gonna negotiate or fight a whole series of concessions before you can actually be here? Is that a fair representation of essentially extending an adversarial attitude that pretty much guides all kinds of development in the city? You really can't do very much in the city without somebody saying you shouldn't.
Well, I think every corporation and every development is different. I do believe that in this particular case, we were talking about partial land that was owned by the city and I believe at the state, but the city and the state partially. So in those particular cases, the land can be actually used in better ways rather than just giving it to the biggest corporation in the world, right? And just say, okay, go ahead, build here, and we all be fine. And whatever tax abatements you want, it's gonna be okay. Whatever $3 billion in total of different kinds of incentives and subsidies that we're gonna be giving, it's all good, right? So there has to be a balance. I think I understand that we live in a capitalist society and we need to just build housing in a way that it actually provides profit as well. But what we are facing today in terms of the housing crisis is that we have not done our job on prioritizing like the kind of housing that we want to build. But instead, we have been giving so much to real estate in terms of abatements and subsidies and for too long, which makes it so that right now, if you walk, let's just take an example in Brooklyn. I live in Brooklyn. I used to live in downtown Brooklyn. This is when I moved to the U.S. I'm not from the U.S. I don't know if you caught that. But when I moved to the U.S., I was living in Brooklyn, and we live in 3rd Avenue, downtown Brooklyn, and we pay rent. I think we pay like $1,200 for a one-bedroom apartment. Now, the same one-bedroom apartment costs $3,500 per month, right? And that was after the building of City Point over there, right? And so we got to think about how all of these developments and all of these corporations that want to come here are also just balancing, like really what the overall impact it is in neighborhoods and in communities. So I would say with Amazon is a specific case because we're talking about the biggest and wealthiest corporation in the world. I think for corporations and real estate, there has to be a balance on what benefits the communities, what benefits, obviously, how can people make profit. We're not saying don't make profit. We live in a capitalist society, whether I like it or not. It is a reality. But we have to balance things, and we have to think about a way in which we can shift the dynamics of power in terms of like how communities can come together, define and decide what they want to do, and work with people who are willing to make profit, also thinking about the bottom line of how those communities are actually going to end.
Having just come from Europe, Europeans, and London is going in the direction a bit of New York, but Europeans are horrified at the way of the power of private corporations over more and more sectors of our economy. I mean, it really has become extreme. I think we have to fight, and we have to propose alternatives. Again, one simple move is relocalizing stuff, the production of stuff, rather than, if I need a computer, yes, I want what do we call it when it is not the firm itself, a franchise, right? But if I need to buy some very elementary food, I don't need a franchise. I don't need it for clothing. I can have local shops. And there was a moment in New York. I'm older than most of you, so I remember something maybe that you don't remember. But there's a moment when in Brooklyn, for instance, they were starting their own digital capabilities. There were two brothers who were brilliant guys, and they started a local network. They were for low-income people. There were all kinds of things happening. And I think it's just gotten killed. We have become so dependent on big corporations, I think it's far more extreme than what you see in Europe. It really is. And why do we owe them so much to these corporations? I don't know about the whether Amazon should or should not have been accepted, because one possibility is that you negotiate, that you say, okay, you want this land? Fine. And not to give them a break for whatever the break was, but to say, then you provide also health care, things for kiddies to play. I mean, something. Make a deal. But this notion that they have this power, I find it absolutely horrifying, what is happening in the United States.
I thought one of the interesting things, one of the takeaways I had from that I wonder about going forward is I think you described cities as a new kind of frontier where the rules of engagement are not clear, but there really is a conflict between different sources of power. And over again in this panel, we've described it in adversarial, sort of all or nothing terms. And somebody from the audience asked a question: is there a better model than this all or nothing? What I'm wondering about is how can New York and other cities create a framework where it's not just, because I think the interesting thing was, I genuinely believe that the city officials who negotiated this deal thought of it as a negotiation, and that everybody was kind of surprised when it became public, and suddenly it turned into a fight, not a negotiation. So I'm wondering whether there is a way to create a framework in which actual negotiation, give and take, can happen, or is New York simply just not that kind of territory?
One thought, and obviously, you know, there are larger economic issues which we have to deal with as a nation and as a society and as an economy. But putting those aside, I think New York actually has lagged quite a bit behind many other cities. For example, Boston, San Francisco, other cities have had what are known as linkage fees, have actually, as part of the ground rules of development, saying commercial development, to get significant financial contributions for housing, childcare, education, workforce
New York did
development.
that too in the past.
Right.
But
New
a
York
long
has
time ago.
done, but one of the fundamental things about all of the systems that seem to work is that they're basically established as clear ground rules, and that the city then says, look, these are our ground, we actively want you, we'll support you, we'll help you, and so forth, but these are our ground rules. But part of the problem, the Amazon deal, Amazon didn't demand any incentives. Amazon basically said to all these cities, what are you offering? And in fact, Amazon made it very clear. Northern Virginia, the site there, offered virtually nothing in the way of incentives. And Amazon made it clear. New Jersey offered far more in the way of financial incentives than New York. Plenty of places did. Amazon made it very clear. It wanted to be in the place which had strong human capital, strong tech infrastructure. But companies want to know, what are the ground rules? You tell me what they are, and I will follow them. If you can basically say, you follow these ground rules, we assure you of being able to fit in. And New York didn't do that. Or what New York did and Amazon accepted turned out in the end not to be the ground rules that were acceptable to a lot of people in the city. But I think you have to first think through the ground rules, always being realistic. Are they things that will still make sense for corporations to locate in your city? Because again, companies have choices. There's always Northern Virginia.
Can I ask each of you to suggest one or two ground rules?
I have something. I mean, a very important ground rule in terms of how do we build our economy is through like how do we create those jobs and how those jobs are career jobs. And I would argue that those jobs happen when they are unionized and provide healthcare, insurance, and pensions. And that's one of the ground rules. Allow for workers to have a neutrality agreement so that they can actually be part of a contract with a union if they wish for. Amazon actively say to a city council hearing, we will not allow for workers to come together and unionize. And that is a big problem.
Well, so just to be clear, would you say that being open to unionization is a ground rule if you want to do business in New York? For all companies moving to New York?
I would say that's one of them.
Because there's an awful lot of businesses that would turn tail and run. Right? Would you accept that?
I mean, then those businesses shouldn't be here.
Okay.
New York City, I'm sorry, but New York City is one of the cities that is very much a unionized city. And if we want to actually grow our economy, we have to think about how we're treating our workers and our workforce. And that is a really fundamental thing that actually we need to tackle on when we talk about growing our economy.
All right. Anybody else want to suggest a ground rule or two for doing business in New York?
Well, I think we should really try to enable small firms rather than these mega firms. I really think it matters. I think there's a lot of talent in a city like this, but they need support because there are all these big firms that can grab, the space, the clients, etc.
And to follow up on that, do you accept the idea that Amazon or companies like Amazon, let's say Google, say, which was not striking the same kind of deals, also fosters the creation of a lot of ancillary small firms around it.
Well, they do. We know that, right? I mean, there are two worlds for these big corporations. One, the one that we know about with all the fancy blah blahs, and then there is that other world where they have a lot of low-wage workers, a lot of impermanent work, or So that's not an ideal model, but that is part of how these big firms function. So the issue is, how can we upgrade that degraded half of all our big corporations have it.
Right, Vishaan,
And they give them a slightly different name so that it doesn't, they don't get mixed up. But it is an abuse, I think.
So do you want to play us out with
Well, I don't know if I have rules, but look, a couple of things. I own a small firm in New York City. It's incredibly difficult. So I think, but first of all, I'm very confused.
You own a small firm?
Yeah, I have a 30-person architecture firm, right? So, the thing is, and we do mainly, first of all, most of our work is in distressed areas like Detroit and Newark, and they would all kill to have our problems, number one. But number two, I don't understand this separation between small firms and big firms. Anyone who operates a small firm knows that you constantly deal with big firms in a business-to-business environment. It's just not so bifurcated. But we're talking about, what I find kind of odd about the conversation is that we're talking about companies. And the highest and best use for land from a pure capitalist standpoint in New York City is not corporate real estate, it's luxury housing. What's going on the Amazon site? It's a bunch of luxury housing. That's what's gonna go there. And so, that's what eats all of our land. And the reason that's true, people will blame real estate developers, you can beat up real estate developers, but the real reason that's true is because everyone who owns land in New York City prices that land for the idea that people will buy condos at these extraordinarily high prices. The reason your rent went up as much as it did is precisely this, because it is almost impossible without tax abatement to build a multifamily rental housing project in this city anymore. It is all condos. It is eating all of our land. It is almost impossible to finance a new office building without tax abatements and other things, because it makes no economic sense relative to those condo prices.
But doesn't that problem become worse when you add high-income jobs? Wasn't that the whole issue around Amazon?
I think, but people have it both ways with this, and again, in the effort of not relitigating the deal, they wanted truck access. That's part of why they were in Long Island City. So I don't understand how it was all white-collar jobs or all blue-collar jobs. But to me, so ground rules, look, Saskia started with the 80s. In 1986 tax reform, what Reagan did is he made it literally illegal for the government to build public housing. And we have all since, and what I found interesting with the Amazon thing is we've all drank the neoliberal Kool-Aid of believing that government's inept. Everyone, and not just right-wingers, everyone. Everyone believes that the people who negotiated the deal were a bunch of morons. I heard that from many progressive friends. They're not morons. The government, we have a very sophisticated government, actually. And, we should have the ability to take, especially public land, and build public housing again, build public low-scale office space again. We don't have that ability right now. And most people will go crazy, because you know why? The second there's a budget overrun, and I'm running that project as a government employee, you people will all come after me. The Post, the News, the New York Times, every single one of you will come after me with venom for misusing your tax dollars. Because that's the neoliberal environment we now sit in, which is why corporations have so much control. So I don't know if that's a ground rule, but we need to get back to the idea that the public can actually make investments, especially with a healthy tax base that actually also has a healthy private sector.
Okay, well, I'm
I
glad
agree
we
with
solved
that.
that problem.
Yes.
We have solved the issue of housing a tech city. So there's really no need for you to go to any of the other panels on this topic or read anything else about it. Thank you all very much for joining us and for your questions, which hopefully I folded into the conversation.